Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the last of this fall's lectures. I would like, because it is the last time this fall, I would love for the members of the Bucket Course Committee to stand up so that they can be recognized and you can appreciate them. Up you go. Well, I have the usual reminders. I thought maybe we'd just do a group reading or call and response to this. Turn on your decoil. See? Put away your cell phone. Oh, nice, nice. Wait for the microphone. Excellent. And here is a new announcement. Art Hyman, as many of you may know, broke his hip last week. And he's been to the hospital in Des Moines, but he's back now. And he's in the Mayflower Health Center in 205. And he says he would like company. Now, I would suggest, that we not all go at once. So, you might put that on your list of things to do. Well, this week we are in our final lecture, sort of bookending our lectures this fall, having both members of the Trish Menner household with us this fall. We started out with Bill Menner talking about agriculture and the federal government's role, and today we're delighted to have Barb Trish here. Barb is professor of political science at Grinnell College, and she also heads the Rosenfield program, and I know many of you go to those wonderful panels and talks that the Rosenfield program provides us. Barb has her PhD from the Ohio State University, and she is here today to help us make sense of, yes, can it be done? The midterm elections. Her title is, How Do We Know?
Thanks, Janet. How about the sound? Good. Good? Okay, good. And I don't think I'm going to be able to make sense of the midterm elections, and I think you might even be a little disappointed about how much I try. Because what I'm really interested in is not the elections, but the elections as a referent to think about how we know things, to think about data and evidence. There's an abundance of data out there, as you know, and most of the things I'm going to talk about today are things that you have access to, especially if you have access to the web. But there's an abundance of data, and these data tell us a lot of really important and useful things about the election and other phenomena out there in the world. But sometimes we interpret them in ways that we probably shouldn't. We draw too many conclusions from the data that we have. So what I'm going to do today is just talk about a couple of the contests that we experienced, that is those of us in Iowa, in this last cycle. Just really look in at the outcomes. I really don't think any of that is going to surprise you. But then use that to focus in on the type of data that are available. Maybe I'll talk about some data that you haven't yet checked in with. And then by the end of the talk, I want to think about how these standards that we have in place for data and evidence seem to have an effect on what campaigns are doing in the political world. That's something that really interests me. That is the extent to which our standards for evidence and understanding affect the things that we do in politics. So that's where I'm headed. Let's see. No, that was good. Okay, good. No, I'm the one who's not working. So this should look like a familiar map to you by now. It's what the congressional delegation in Iowa is going to look like come 2019 when the new Congress takes effect. And if we move from the, excuse me, we move from the first district, this is us up here, where Grinnell is. And if you can see, I'm sure you can all see the blue, but there's a little bit of blue shading in here and here. This means it's flipped. The district has flipped from Republican to Democratic. And as we all know, it's a flip here from Rod Blum to Abby Finkenauer, who will be one of the youngest, not the youngest, but one of the youngest members of Congress when she takes over that seat. This is the Loebsack district, includes the second district, includes Johnson County, left-leaning district. Loebsack has now become a very senior member of Congress. It's interesting to think about that, because I knew him when he was an academic, as some of you probably did as well. Then over here in the third district, this is the one that includes Des Moines, had a hotly contested primary battle. Our district did as well. But this is the one that pitted Cindy Axne against David Young. And it was close. We weren't sure the way it was going to go, but Cindy Axne pulled out. I mean, and it's very interesting that now we've got quite a change, both in color, but a change in terms of the gender balance of the congressional delegation. And then throw in Joni Ernst in the Senate, and I was doing pretty well in terms of federal offices as well as the governor's seat. And then up here in the, I am just having a hard time here. Actually, this is the fourth district, right? I may have used the wrong numbers, but that's Steve Kingland up there. That's a good red area, election after election, and Representative King faced a pretty significant challenge by J.D. Scholten, who gave him a run for his money, but prevailed in the end. So none of this is surprising. Where do we get these data? Well, we have federal control of elections in the U.S. Much of what goes on is dictated by the states. And for instance, in Iowa, we count up our votes. County auditor actually does that. Passes it along to the Secretary of State. They pass it along to the federal government and news organizations, and that's how we know who wins. It's not too mysterious. We can find more information about who's winning an election. This is actually the Secretary of State's webpage. It's notable to me, at least, that they're contracting out to a private firm to produce this particular display. So these are the data that the county auditor collects, sends off to the state contracts with this private firm, and then we see them in a way that's interactive. So if you're on the website of the Secretary of State, you have to click to get the information, but it looks very nice. As one of my students put it the other day when we were looking at this the day after the election, oh, that's pretty. Well, it's not just pretty, but it's interactive. In the details here, you probably can't see from the back there, but the blue represents Finkenauer, it's her state win, and the red Blum, and the write-ins and the third-party candidate. I'm going to focus in a little on this in a moment, maybe right now. So we've got a 51-46 win for Abby Finkenauer in this district. Let me just check to make sure I've got the numbers right. This is a significant win. Now, going into the election, she was leading in the polls, so this didn't surprise people if they put any faith in the polls. But, of course, after 2016, some of us don't put as much faith in the polls as we did in the past, or at least are a little more careful to scrutinize the polls. But for Blum, he had beaten his 2014 opponent, Monica Vernon, handily by 8 points, had beaten in his first win Pat Murphy of Dubuque, a prominent Democrat in the state, by 2 points. And so you could think of this as an upset, but to the extent that we sort of expected it, it probably wasn't interpreted as an upset. Now, already so far, what we have are some basic data. We know a lot. We know who won. We know by how much someone won. But we really want to know more than that. We want to know why this particular outcome, what accounted for it. Was it the president? Were people voting against the president? Is it a referendum on the president? Was this a blue wave? I mean, it looks like, according to the news that we've seen in the last couple of days, people are interpreting the House victories as a blue wave. Did Abby effectively campaign? Can we credit her with something? Were the ethics violations that had plagued Representative Blum part of this as well? In other words, there are all sorts of different possible explanations from the outcome, and to use social scientific terminology, all sorts of variables that you'd want to put into a consideration of what happened. Let's just check in with the governor's race. This one may have surprised some people, and I'll get to this in a moment. But this is a pretty significant victory for Kim Reynolds. She hadn't been at the top of the ticket before. She had been the previous governors, Terry Branstad's running mate and lieutenant governor, and then when he left to be ambassador to China, she took over. There were a lot of concerns about her ability to really be governor and not just be the sidekick of the governor. Fred Hubbell, of course, was a prominent name in Iowa. Des Moines businessman, wealthy man, had run Yonkers department store, which was played up in the campaign ads by the Republicans, had worked for the state, ran the Department of Economic Development. So he certainly was a credible candidate. And the surprise for some people, I think, was due in part to things like this. This was the headline from the Des Moines Register on the Sunday before the election. Just days before election, Iowa poll shows Fred Hubbell with 2-point lead over Kim Reynolds. This was a similar margin he was thought to lead by in the previous Iowa poll weeks earlier. So this made people think, well, Hubbell's ahead, got a couple of polls that are showing this, he probably will pull it out. But in fact, when you dive a little deeper into this and you really think about what the evidence from the polls tell you, you don't have the same sort of certainty that that headline would suggest. I'm just going to read this passage on the left. And this is in the fine print of the Iowa poll. There's something like this attached to any good poll out there, telling the readers really what they should make of the results. And it says, questions based on the subsample of 801 Iowa likely voters have a maximum margin of error of plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. This means that if the survey were repeated using the same questions and the same methodology 19 times out of 20, the findings would not vary from the true population value by more than plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. This is really important information because it's telling us how to interpret the values that emerge from the poll data. Just to highlight this, think about the poll data, an estimate of, say, the president's approval rating or Hubbell's likely support in the election as simply a value that emerges from the poll itself. The poll is meant to, or the sample on which the poll is based is meant to be an approximation of some population, the population being all Iowa voters. And you know that it's probably a decent approximation if the poll is taken correctly, constructed correctly, if the sample is done right, but it's just an approximation and it has associated error with it. The way that you think about this and really the logic behind this interpretation is that you imagine what would happen if you did a large number of samples, maybe an infinite number of samples, from the same population with the same conditions, and each sample would come up with a slightly different estimate of Hubbell's support. And you would expect that because you're taking a sample. If you wanted complete certainty about what Hubbell's support was, you would check in with the entire population of Iowa. Not practical. So if you imagine these repeated samples, then you think about, according to the laws of statistics, the fact that there's going to be some range of values around the poll finding that's going to, in most cases, capture what the true population value is. And it's plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. It's a range around the estimate that the poll generates. So with that in mind, just with that in mind, we know that 54 or 52%, whatever the value was, that was behind that 2% lead for Hubble, probably should be thought of more as a range of values, plus or minus 3.5% around that. And then secondly, and this is also very important, the most of the time. Most of the time, that range is going to capture the true population value, but most of the time really means 19 out of 20 times, or 95% of the times. So if you get something that's way off, you know, a sample that has a projection that's far distant from what the population would be saying, you're not too concerned because you expect that to happen now and then. You don't expect it to happen all the time. So what the problem is, when we look at these polling data, we're inclined to give them much more certainty and precision than they probably deserve. So here's an example of, we've got decent data, decent evidence, it's just that we tend to misinterpret it, and sometimes we're led to a misinterpretation by analysts or the media, which I think we had with the Des Moines Register. Okay. Now, bear with me while I deal with my handouts. Let's try to figure out a little bit more about that Finkenauer vote. Finkenauer and Blum vote. What I'm going to show you now is, and you're not going to be able to see it very well, so I'll try to describe it, and then I'll zoom in a moment. I'm going back to the State of Iowa Secretary of State pretty display. And here we have, actually there's nothing too much pretty here, is there? But we've got the votes of Finkenauer and Blum, and I think the very next page is zooming in a little bit. Right. It's interesting because what the Secretary of State and the auditor is able to do is to distinguish basically how people cast their vote. And so in this display, we're distinguishing election day voting, on Tuesday, from absentee voting. And as you probably know, if you pay any attention to Iowa politics, Iowa has a very liberal absentee or early voting law. You don't have to give an excuse. They make it pretty easy. It's a little bit harder than it used to be, but pretty easy to cast an absentee ballot, and a lot of people do. So what we've done is here, in this display, we have a breakdown of the Democrats, that's Finkenauer vote, in the county, 3,933, to Blum's 4,034. So at the county level, we actually have a lead for, or a win for Blum. Now, of course, everyone's trying to figure out exactly what's going on here, but what accounts for this? And notice that, oh, I have added this. Notice that the Democrat, compared to the Republican, has significantly higher, more than 600 higher absentee ballots than the Republican. That's not too surprising either, because the Democratic Party for the last, I'd say 18 years or so, things seem to, in my mind, turn around at about 2000, have really focused on getting people, known Democratic supporters, to vote early so that they don't have to worry about them come election day. So you've got what you might expect in terms of the pattern between Democratic and Republican absentee votes, more Democratic than Republican, although it's not that big a difference. I think if we had figures from 2000, 2002, 2004, we'd see a much bigger gap. But it's tempting to look at something like this and say, at the county level, at least, it looks like Finkenauer may have staved off a bigger loss at the county level by her effort at absentee, to getting absentee votes. But that's a little bit suspect because, you know they voted for her, but you don't know, maybe they would have voted for her on election day anyway. That's the hard thing to discern with absentee ballots, whether it's a good use of energy for the party to go after these early voters when in fact they might be people who would have voted anyway on election day. So we've got some data, but we'd like to have a little more information to be able to figure out what's going on. Let me narrow our focus a little bit more. This is going to be hard to read, and I'll try to do a good job of describing what we have here. If the Secretary of State now is providing pretty data, these are not that pretty. These are, and this is a much simplified spreadsheet that you can, well, I'm sure you can get it now, but you certainly could get it in the past. And what I've done is I've gotten rid of a lot of columns and rows in this, and have included only the U.S. representative, the House races, so Democratic and Republican here, for 1st Ward Grinnell and 4th Ward Grinnell. So 1st Ward is over there, on the other side of Highway 6. That's where college proper is in 1st Ward Grinnell. A lot of the students live in 1st Ward Grinnell and others. 4th Ward Grinnell, Don Smith. We're in 4th Ward right now, right? So, I thought those might be good reference to have in place. And then what also I'm showing here is, this is 1st Ward Grinnell in 2016 and 1st Ward Grinnell in 2018, 4th Ward 16, 4th Ward 18, and then a total for the entire county in 16 and a total for the entire county in 18. So it's breaking it down. It's more granular data. A little bit more. You still don't know how individuals, you don't know much about why individuals are voting the way they are, but it's really tempting to look at these data and to try to draw some conclusions about what's going on at the individual level. Let's just look at, here's 2016 1st Ward, over north of Highway 6. The Democrat, and that's Monica Vernon, in 2016 has 1,033 votes. The Republican, that's Rod Blum, 295. Boy, that's, if there were more districts or more precincts or wards like that in the state of Iowa, the Democratic Party would be thrilled. The 1st Ward is a mainstay of support for the Democratic Party. And just a little bit on nomenclature here, we call them wards in Grinnell, the same sort of political unit as a precinct in a non-Grinnell part of the county. That's language, if you know politics in other states, that you may find very confusing, because, for instance, in Cook County, Chicago, the old Daily machine, the ward was a more inclusive political unit than the precinct, but we use the two interchangeably here. So in 2018, you've got a pretty sizable win for Finkenauer, the Democratic candidate in Ward 1. It's not surprising that the numbers are lower, because turnout is lower generally in midterm years than presidential years, although it looks like both in the local area and nationally the turnout is higher, has been higher this last midterm than in previous midterms. I'll just review these 4th Ward figures as well. 4th Ward also leans Democratic. In 2016, it was Vernon, close to 700, Blum, close to 500. 2018, Finkenauer, a little bit closer to 600, and Blum, 400. So it looks like it's a slightly smaller margin there. But it's hard to avoid looking at data like these and try to figure out, why the difference between these 2 years? Was there something that Finkenauer, the Democrat, did better or worse in one particular year? And there's only so much you can get from the actual data without making assumptions about what individuals are doing that you really shouldn't be doing. Okay, so one of the questions that people have might be on your mind about First Ward, Grinnell, is, what about those pesky students? Is there something about what's going on over there at the college that helps account for the strength of Finkenauer in the last election? She was a young candidate. She seemed to do a good job sending her people to the college, connecting with students. Is it all a college student phenomenon? And this is a lead from an Iowa public radio piece on October 17th. October 16th was the last satellite voting station at the college. The satellite voting stations are these sort of pop-up elections, election sites that are fueled by absentee or early voting. So you're still voting early, but you're doing it in a place that looks a lot like election day. And the county county auditor, sets up the satellite voting in various places. There was one here on in this very site the Saturday before the election. So this lead, though, of the Iowa Public Radio piece said that more than 500 people voted early in a single day at a small Iowa college campus. The turnout at the Grinnell College precinct in Poweshiek County would equate to almost 1/3 of the student body. Politicos say it's a sign that younger voters are more engaged this election cycle. It's hard not to look at those values and think, oh my gosh, the students are really voting. But the problem is, anyone could vote in that contest. Anyone at that satellite, anyone in the county, you just didn't have to be in First Ward. And so I can't tell you how many people cited this to me as a sign that student involvement was very high this year. And I think it was high, but these data don't let you say that it's high. These data let you say that about 500 people from the county voted in a particular satellite. How would you know if students voted? Well, you could set yourself outside and try to identify students as student, not student, and count up the students. That's a credible way to judge whether a student is voting. Because this is a matter of public record, that is, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, whether someone votes or doesn't vote is no mystery. We know that. You can actually check the addresses. And if you could match up dorm addresses to the voter files, you might have a decent sense of not student voting, but at least students who live in dorms, their voting. So there's a way to get at this. I don't have any reason to believe that people making the claim that this suggested high student turnout were doing anything like that. Let's see. But we do have more information, and we'll have even better information about the extent of student voting in the future. Grinnell College is now part of the acronym is pronounced apparently NSOL. Boy, oh boy. There. NSLVE, which stands for the National Study of Voting, Learning, and Engagement, which is an operation out of Tufts University. It's one of those centers, and many of these have popped up in the last 20 years. It's really focused on increasing student turnout or the turnout of young people. As you probably know, turnout of younger Americans lags behind turnout of others. And so this is seen as a real concern, not just because it's low and students or young folks don't have voice, but because there's a worry that they will become habituated into not voting and that there won't be any change in the future. What NSLV or NSOL does is it takes information from the state, the kind of stuff that not we're looking at today, but that's available from the state of Iowa about the voting, the list of registered voters. Catalyst is a nonprofit firm that takes the state voting information and it merges it with other information. And it compiles sort of a list of registered voters from all states. It checks in every election and sees who voted and who didn't vote. It's a matter of public record. It's just sort of a big data collection problem. And then they actually merge it with commercial databases and other data that are out there that allow them to know more about the voters. It's kind of eerie, but that's what everyone knows about all of us here and all other registered voters. Then what NSLVDE does is they also collect information from colleges, and they actually get the names of the students at the college and some more information about them, like what their majors are, things like that. And so when you merge those data together, you can actually see the voter turnout of particular college campuses, provided that the college is part of this NSOL enterprise. And you see the results are quite shocking about those highly active Grinnell College students. Namely that voter turnout at Grinnell is low, which is kind of shockingly low, has been shockingly low. The first entry here is just comparing 2012 to 16. That makes sense because they're both presidential years, probably higher than the midterm results. But in 2012, the voter turnout was 43%. 2016, lower at 41%. And that's lower than the rest of the population in general. Grinnell College, you might be asking, well, isn't it like that everywhere? No, it's kind of shocking. Turnout at the college is about 10 percentage points lower than the average for other colleges and universities. This applied both in 2012 and 2014. And the thing is, there was a slight uptick in voter turnout among colleges in general from 2012 to 2014, but that didn't happen at Grinnell. Actually, the turnout went down. So these are going to be very interesting data for the college to try to make sense of. I have some methodological questions about them. Anytime you start talking about a data set, and in particular a big data set like this, it's a given that there's going to be error. And I'm curious about whether there's more error in the Grinnell readings than in other schools' readings. You know, it might be harder to trace a student from New York who's at Grinnell voting absentee in New York than it is to trace a student from Dordt College in Northwest Iowa from the area who's voting in the area. I'm not sure. But I suspect at a minimum, even if we are able to eliminate some of the error, we'll see that there's some progress to be made in voter turnout at Grinnell College. The data for 2018 will be available in the summer because it takes a lot to actually make all those matches that have to go into the bigger data set. So, okay. So what we have here is some complementary data allowing us to say a little bit more useful information to help us make sense of an election outcome. There's even more information that you can get about early voters. And here, I'm not above using my husband as an example. What we have here is, I accessed the Secretary of State's website, and individuals have an ability to track whether their absentee ballot, early ballot, has been recorded by the state. And so it's very easy to do. You could probably, if you knew the birth date of other people, you could probably find out a lot just from your computer. You can find out this information more generally for the county if you go to the county auditor's office. So that's no mystery, but they make it very easy. So I entered my husband's name and birth date, and I see that he requested a ballot on the 9th of October. He was sent the ballot on the 9th of October, and he returned it. That means he voted in a satellite station. You know, it all happens at once there. But if you're requesting a ballot from home, then it takes a little while for the auditor to process, maybe a day. She sends it to you, and then you return it. And much of what goes on campaigns and parties in an election season is trying to get those absentee ballots back. I suspect that some of you were on that job in this last election. But it always strikes me as interesting, and I think students, when I talk about this, are kind of struck by it as well, that this is public information. Whether a person votes is a matter of public record. I mean, think about it. The reason is because you want to prevent fraud, or you want to have a check. You have an election total that's generated by the state. The sum of individuals voting should be the same as the sum of the aggregates in the election total. So it's, it's perfectly reasonable that this is a matter of public record. We don't know for whom the person voted, because that's not. 5 minutes? Okay. All right. So we can get a little more information, though. So what I had shown you was what individuals can find about absentee ballots sent out and returned at the state level. What I have here are data at the aggregate level, summaries for states that are collected by a political scientist, Michael McDonald, who runs the U.S. Election Project, and you probably heard a lot of sound bites from him before the election, because he does a terrific job of making sense of what's going on with both early voting across the states and other things. So I'm sure you can't see this, and again, this is just another extraction from a bigger data set. But here you have Iowa, and I just kept Kansas in there because alphabetically it came right after, and I thought it was an interesting comparison. But we know that some 560,000 early ballot requests were submitted. Some 500,000 ballots were returned. And don't be too concerned, because this was as of November 2nd. So some of those came in by the time of the election, but I guarantee not all of them did. And the other thing that's interesting, and I think we'll just stop with this, I'll ask you to think about it here, and I'll read this again because you probably can't see it. Because Iowa is a state that has people register as a Democrat or a Republican in order to vote in a primary election, the state list of registered voters indicates your party registration. That is unsettling to some people, but it's basically the cost of participating in a party's primary election. So we have in Iowa, you can see the distribution of those absentee ballots across registered partisans. So in Iowa you had, let's see, 43% of those early votes, at least as of November 2nd, were Democrats, 35% Republicans. This is, now remember, this is just their party registration. It's not for whom they voted, but it's very, very tempting to think that someone who's a good Democrat, a registered Democrat, is certainly going to be voting for a Democrat, and the same for the Republican. So you've got interesting information that is susceptible to misinterpretation. I think that maybe we'll just check in with Kansas in the minute that remains. Kansas, of course, is a much more right-leaning state than Iowa, so it's not too surprising that there is a lower percentage of the early voters who were Democrats in Kansas than Republicans. That's 50% of, or 49% of the early voters were registered Republicans, and 34% registered Democrats. So, despite some interesting Democratic successes in Kansas this year, you still see evidence, at least this evidence, that the Republicans are doing something remarkable in Kansas. So.
Thank you, Barb, and we're going to take a 10-minute break right now.
I had a couple of questions over the break about those data that informed the estimates of voter turnout at Grinnell College among students. And basically versions of the same really good question, and that is, are they able to exclude international students from the count? Because that, given the sizable number of students, international students at college, you'd basically be increasing the denominator of a voter turnout calculation, which would mean that the turnout would look lower. They do eliminate the international students. So what I want to do now is, I think we've had enough just checking in with data and values and things like that, but I just want to talk a little more broadly about politics that really runs on data. And I probably won't show you any more values, but there are a couple of more things I want to point out to you. So let's see. There's a lot that we know, or that we should know. We generally know less about why something happens than that it happens, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out why something happens. I am really taken with an idea from a political scientist, Marjorie Randon Hershey, who wrote in about 1980 or so, thinking about campaign politics, that it's really difficult to figure out, A, what an election outcome means, and B, what something that a campaign does in order to hopefully win, what sort of impact that it actually has. I mean, an election outcome, if you think about it, the sort of vote distribution that we saw basically tells us that someone won. We don't know for sure what, or maybe, or someday we'll know, but you don't know what that campaign did or what accounted for a particular win. You don't know with campaign tactics, the effectiveness of campaign tactics. For example, my husband ran for the state legislature in 2000 and lost to Danny Carroll. But I spent much of my time that summer and fall trying to pull together crews for parades, which I know others in this room have done that for a long time as well, and buying the appropriate candy that would not melt, and it was quite horrible. And I was pretty sure that that wouldn't make or break his campaign. That is, if we skipped a couple of parades, if he was going to win, he'd still win. But I was pretty sure, but I was not certain. So I didn't want to risk it. You know, if we missed Deep River, what if that parade had been the very thing that would have caused him to win? So there's a lot of thought given into campaign politics, has been for a long time. A lot of thought given to trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. What's happened in the last 12 years or so is that the campaigns have started using methodology of social science in order to figure this out. And in particular, they rely on randomized controlled experiments in order to be able to isolate the effect of something, some voter contact or something in the campaign. And what this means is, what this reliance on this sort of social scientific ethos to run a campaign, or at least to infuse in the campaign, what that means is that there's a premium placed on things that can be tracked. Okay, let me give you an example. I'm going to talk about what I think was an experiment. Well, first, let me just make sure that everyone's on board with the idea of a randomized control experiment. The kind of thing that the scientists do, the kind of thing that happens in pharmaceutical research, in which you're really trying to figure out the effect of something, and you set up an experiment such that you can isolate the effect of a particular stimulus. So a classical experiment, and this is a simplified view of it, this wouldn't be the best experiment in the world, but a typical classical experiment would have two groups, a control group and an experimental group, that are similar in every respect except one is in the control, one is a control group and the other an experimental group. The control group is not going to get the treatment, we'll get a placebo pill if it's pharmaceutical research, as opposed to the experimental group, which would get the real drug that they're trying to test. Then what you do is, as long as you've done some random assignment of subjects into these two groups, you kind of randomize, much as you would do random selection if you're taking a poll, in order to be able to conclude things about the larger population. In this case, you're assigning subjects randomly into the two groups, so that you're pretty sure that the two groups are the same except for that experimental treatment, that is the presence or absence of the experimental treatment or the stimulus. And then what you do is you check in afterwards and you see if there are differences between the two groups, then you conclude that those differences are due to the treatment. And so you're able to isolate a cause of something. And this is the sort of thing that's great to be able to do in your lives. Like if I drink 8 glasses of water a day, am I going to be healthier? If I get 10 hours of sleep, am I going to be a smarter person? The problem is, in your real life, you can't really, you're just one person, and you can't control all of the other things. So this is a model that doesn't necessarily work in our private lives, but when campaigns use it, can use it, they try to. So here's the example I wanted to show you about. I'll zoom in on this in a moment. This was a mail piece I got in 2014. It's from the League of Conservation Voters. Came to my home. It revealed some information. This is a zoom in on that. Some of these are my children. Kate, whose name I crossed out because the first time I used this, she was a college student at Grinnell and I was using it in a class, and I thought, oh, I better give her some anonymity, even though it's a matter of public record. My other children, my husband, me, were missing a child somehow. Whatever data infused this was missing Robert. And then indications of whether all of us voted in the past two elections. Anne was probably not voting in November of 2010 because she was too young. Okay? Kate was not voting because she was too young in those elections. I mean, the point is they're accessing, at least for this flyer, the information provided by the state. They have access to those lists of registered voters and the record of people's participation in an election. Then what, and I probably can't even read if I wanted to what the text said. I can. The chart below shows your household's public voting record in past elections, as well as an empty space we will fill out to indicate if you vote in this year's general election on Tuesday, November 4th. We intend to mail you an updated chart after the election that will show you whether or not you voted. I don't know why we would need that. But in any case, the idea here is they're trying to capture some cognitive process or something in me internally that says, oh my gosh, I'm going to see whether I voted or my kids voted, and that might incentivize me to vote in an election. There are many iterations of experiments like this out there. You may or may not be subject to it because they're done on very relatively few people. You all get calls from campaigns or polls, but this is a much smaller group of people that they're checking in with to do these experiments. You might get them and you just might not know you're a subject of an experiment. But there are other experiments like this that tell the person that we're going to let your neighbors know whether you voted or not. I mean, and it's a little bit questionable. It's fine to do. It's a matter of public record. I mean, there's some concerns about the ethics of that. Other experiments that might look at the effect of, say, someone showing up at your door and canvassing, as opposed to calling you on the phone to get you to vote. So this is the world of campaign politics, and it very much, the results of this very much infuse what happens in campaigns. What it means is that, and this is something that I haven't fully developed yet, but I think what it means is this certainty that this sort of experimental methodology provides for campaigns, provides them with an incentive to do the sort of actions that can be tracked. You know, so for example, I might master this by the end of the talk. For example, a phone call that you get at home or a canvasser at your door, it's very easy to know then that you were the person receiving that contact, and then afterwards, after the election, they can check to see whether you voted or didn't vote. I mean, the experiments are set up like this, and then the campaigns use the results of the experiment to try to increase, for example, voter turnout, and then they refine the data that they have in order to work into the future in an optimal way. The emphasis is put on things that are trackable. You know, that's a language when you talk to campaign managers and people, especially in the field. Trackable. What can we track? So I've added this slide for Don Smith, because Don and many of the rest of you probably love yard signs. Don loves yard signs. and then I'll talk about what this is. Yard signs aren't particularly trackable. I mean, you know who has a yard sign, you know a campaign knows how many they produce. What they don't know is who sees a yard sign. You know, so it's not easy to track at the individual level the impact of a yard sign. And I think this, in large part, is the reason that campaigns these days and parties are more reluctant to rely on yard signs. I mean, they might say, well, we found them to be ineffective, but I think what they're thinking is, we can't track them like we can track the voter at the individual level. This is, and I know you can't see this, but this is a call sheet that's generated by the Democratic Party or a Democratic campaign. And if you could see it, you would see each of these sort of horizontal layers here, an individual, and information from the voter file about the individual, the person's name, age, gender, things like that, address. And then what's over here, and this is what the person making the call or canvassing would be filling out. Some indications of, for example, whether the address is correct, or whether the person supported the party, supported the candidate or didn't support the candidate. So a lot of campaign attention is focused on making sure that the lists that generate this information are refined as much as possible, they're clean, they're as accurate as possible, and as you know, if you're involved in this world, they're never accurate. There's a lot of inaccuracies in it. But then they continually update it after elections to see whether that person voted or not. So they know whether they contacted this person. I'm simplifying it, but they know whether they contacted the person, and then they connect it to a vote to see whether that contact actually mattered. And so if you volunteer for a campaign in the 20th century, this is probably your life. You're not stuffing envelopes. You're not necessarily going out and doing other things that probably are effective in terms of advancing the cause of your candidate, but you're channeling your energies into things that can be tracked. I can't help but think, when I view that reality, this is a quotation from a philosopher of science: give a small boy a hammer and he will find that everything he encounters needs pounding. You know, you give a party or a campaign the ability to track something, and they find that the only things that they want to do, or better yet, the knowledge that some of the things that you are able to track and some of the contacts that you are make in the process are effective, then everything that they want to do gets channeled into that. I need to be able to track it to see if it's effective. Because it makes sense. That justifies the kind of value of what they're doing. Donors will give money if they are more likely to give money if a campaign or a party can say, oh, we talked to 3 million people last week on their doorsteps, or better yet, we talked to 3 million people and our research tells us that if we talk to a person, we increase the likelihood that he's going to vote by 2 percentage points or something like that. So there are a lot of sort of artifactual or byproduct good things that happen or that come along with being able to track things and to judge or be able to quantify the impact. But at the same time, you know, there's something about it that makes me think, are they missing the boat? Is there some opportunity cost? Are they channeling their activity into something that's reasonable, but maybe there's something better out there as well? Anyway, this is the thing that really keeps me up at night, if anything does, about politics. This actually does. But just stepping back a little bit further, we've got a lot of data. We're infusing the standards of social science into what we're doing, maybe for better, maybe for worse. Do you have any questions?
And if so, yes.
Is there any data on how influential these horrible negative ads are?
Yeah, people have studied that. I don't know what they're doing right now. This is sort of an interesting social scientific quandary, though. let me just show you something. Well, I'll show you something in a moment. We know the ads run. We know the market in which they run. What we don't know is who sees them. There are Nielsen ratings of shows and stations and things like that. So you have a sense of what the audience share is. But what you'd really like to know in order to figure out whether a negative ad has any sort of impact in encouraging someone to vote or depressing the vote or changing or not changing the percentage, you'd really want to know that a person saw that ad. And so much of the research that's done on this is actually done with experiments. Not the sort of experiments that I showed you there, that's a field experiment, but an actual lab experiment where you have someone actually view the ad and then record responses to it. Problem there is that's an artificial setting to bring someone into a lab and expose them to an ad and see what their response is. The short answer to do they matter or not, there's a lot of conflicting evidence. They may depress turnout. They probably don't change people's vote. I'd like to.
I'd like to make a comment on that. I like a candidate to tell me what they're going to do, not what's wrong with their opponent. And so I have a tendency to want to vote for the other person. And then when they both do it, I have the attitude going to the election to vote for the lesser of two evils.
So that your first tendency to vote for the person who was the subject of the negative attack, you might be unique. I mean, I think a lot of times I come up with, well, this is what, if the party calls me one more time and asks me to vote, I'm actually going to vote for the Republican Party. Well, no, I'm not going to do that, but it's sort of the same sort of maybe rational, logic, but I can understand that.
They spent a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to say a couple of things about Iowa voting. And I'm not a social scientist. This is impressionistic. But the first has to do with college students voting. When I came here, almost 50 years ago, college students just didn't vote here, right? Or one or two might, but a few activists. I think it has to do partly with the 18-year-old vote, which was fairly new in, say, 1972, and the parties just didn't understand maybe how to get them. The second thing I'd like to say, and I'd like to do this historically, is to study the behavior, say in Powashik County, of the rural precincts. When I came here, Malcolm was a Democratic precinct. You could count on carrying Malcolm. And the study of those would, I believe, reveal an almost total collapse of the Democratic vote in the rural precincts. Part of that, I think, has to do with demographic change. We have a lot fewer of the kind of voter that Donna Winburn represents in the rural precincts. Cindy Axney carried the 3rd district. I believe there are 14 counties in it. She carried only one, Polk County. In our district, the Democratic candidate carried 5 counties out of 13, I believe. And exception that proves the rule, the one quote-unquote rural county that she carried was Winneshiek. What is in Winneshiek County? Luther College. And I think some comparative examination of these counties might be useful.
Good point. Good point. I mean, it's in the interest of the state level campaigns, like a gubernatorial or a U.S. Senate campaign, I don't like this, but it's in the interest of, in terms of getting across the line to deploy their resources efficiently, and it's a heck of a lot more efficient to focus on the urban areas than the rural areas. I mean, anyone who's gone out canvassing in a rural area knows that it's a lot different than walking into an apartment building and going, if you can get in, going door to door in an apartment building. So in some ways it's rational in the short term for those candidates to focus on urban areas. It works to the disadvantage of those down ballot though. I mean, for instance, if there's the conceit that, say in the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is all about this, of a coordinated campaign that is a unified effort of Democrats, all the Democrats on the ticket, Hubble, Finkenauer, and I mean, just down the ticket, a unified effort. The idea that a rising tide lifts all ships, you know, that's the language that they always use. Well, the rising, although it didn't work out this way, the rising tide for Fred Hubble might be to focus his efforts at Polk County, Johnson, you know, Lynn County, the big population centers of the state. That's not going to help Jason Rauterbush in Grinnell, although the example is really bad because Rauterbush won and Hubble didn't. But you know, there's something perverse about kind of how candidates within parties work together or don't work together that kind of exacerbates or contributes to that too.
I forgot how to say your name.
George Strait, Barb. Well, I remember when the Iowa poll came out with a 2% lead for Hubble, then there was a sort of a sub-headline about the individual qualities of the candidate questions. And in those, as I recall, Reynolds sort of was leading Hubble by 7 to 9 or something in terms of positives. I guess I'm asking, what should one look more at those things when you look at poll results rather than the aggregate?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably should look at both. The question I'd have though about those things, you know, leadership quality, whatever, is like, what exactly is going to be important? I mean, you've got such a compelling single, who are you going to vote for? And presumably the respondent in the poll is being forthcoming about that, which may or may not be the case, but you've got a mix of qualities. She does better in terms of leadership, he does better in terms of something else. How to know what to put into that mix is a bit of a question. I have no doubt that the pollsters and the analysts who focus on polling data have some sense of what to do. But you have alternative measures, sure, look at them.
Gordon Packard, I have a question in regard to how voting is done in Iowa now. For the first time, we dropped the straight ticket option. I doubt that there's enough knowledge yet to have much comment about that. But my question is that going to potentially affect the voting in Iowa in the coming years? It's more difficult for some people to fill a square properly than when you've got to do every one of them. It becomes discouraging to try to make those votes. There's also reasons not to have a straight ticket vote. Your comments about what that influence might be.
Yeah, the first thing you said that we'll probably know more at some point is probably too early to know the effect of that. I don't think that stopped some people from speculating a little bit, because it's really tempting to see what the discrepancy in turnout. Hubble loses, Finkenauer wins. And to say, oh, if there had been a straight ticket option, then you might have had less split ticket voting. That's exactly what you can't do though. I mean, the data you don't know at an individual level who voted for Finkenauer, who voted for Hubble. And so whoever does the analysis is going to have to make sure that they get their hands on good data to do it. And it's probably going to have to be survey data, because that's the only way that we're going to know at the individual level who votes for or who has voted for whom. I don't know. I mean, on one hand, I think, oh, filling in a circle, how hard is that? But every time I vote in Iowa, I think, am I filling in this circle right? What happens if I invalidate my vote? Things, I mean, we do make it hard. It's a lot easier. Dory Lamont, who worked in the auditor's office for years, showed my class recently the mechanical voting machine at the Grinnell Historical Museum, which I would highly recommend seeing if you can get into the carriage house to see it. But it seemed in those days all you had to do is flip the, it was very clear and very easy to push a lever down. Well, first you had to push the curtain around you, push the lever down, and you voted Democratic or Republican. So I don't know. I mean, as a person who likes the idea of strong parties, I mean, I think parties can be functional in a system, maybe not the way they're structured now. I like the idea of being able to vote a straight ticket. So I don't know what's going to happen.
I see you.
Harriet Egelberg. I have just a comment. I did think, I first thought, oh no, because I'm a little bit spastic when I fill in things. On the other hand, it does make you more thoughtful because you do look at every candidate. And I think it will encourage perhaps more split, thoughtful votes. My other question about, in terms of things that may affect elections, is how about debates? I watched the first Hubble debate with Kim Reynolds, and if I were completely neutral, I would have said that she, quote unquote, won that debate. And I just wondered, we do these debates, they're not so much debates as just a chance to sort of explain your views, whether they have done anything to study what that does in terms of choice.
Yeah, people have tried to study debates and other sort of media as well. And well, the line of research is called the minimal effects research. I think that should be telling that there's probably not as much impact as you would imagine of a debate. I mean, no, it's not going to change someone's mind if they've already decided for whom to vote, and it's not going to change the strong partisan's mind. But there are people in the middle who haven't made up their mind, and so they're subject to change. I think the bigger impact of a debate, though, beyond what it might do for an individual, is how it changes the dynamics of the campaign. For instance, think about, was it in 2012 in Denver when Obama just really faltered and it looked like, oh my gosh, he's going to lose the election because of it. Well, that probably kicked things into place that helped account for his stronger showing than it might have happened right after the debate. It's really hard to judge, though. I mean, much like judging the impact of an advertisement, about the best you can get is some sort of experimental setting. What they often do is they have clickers. Some sort of device that allows the subject in this experiment or the setting to actually respond in kind of a real-time fashion to the things that are being said. So just imagine you have a green for good, a red for bad, and you're asked to click every 20 seconds. And so you can get a real sense of the reaction. That kind of stuff is probably more important for the campaign and refining its measure than in figuring out what sort of impact the debate had.
Well, my name is Steve Batiste. One thing I need to keep in mind that we as a body voted, but roughly half stayed home, so essentially the third choosing none of the above. And even in your specific example of the early absentee voting in Kansas and Iowa, I noticed the numbers for Dems and R was less than the total number. Where do the other numbers come from?
The total number of votes, or I mean, so some people are voting at the polls, so that's the difference there. But I mean, regardless, you're absolutely right. Turnout is low. I mean, when you compare it to levels of turnout in other democracies, it's low. Although other democracies have also experienced a decrease in turnout over the years, making us a little closer to them. There has been an upswing, though, in the last, over the last 20 years or so in turnout. I mean, it's not the depth that it was, though midterms still lag behind presidential years. And I mean, this is depending on your perspective, I mean, it's a problem. there should be full participation or much fuller participation, and there should be informed participation as well. There is, though, the idea that, and this is an idea maybe originally credited to Rousseau, the idea that actually participating has an educative value to it. That is, if you make someone, or you don't give anyone an option but to participate, you make sure that they vote, then at least this is the hope, that they will become more educated, knowing that that's the responsibility that they have. I mean, it's sort of a pipe dream, but I always think about that when people say, well, we only want interested and educated people and informed people voting. Well, maybe some good would come if you had a system that really encouraged everyone to vote, then maybe they rise to the challenge, become more interested and informed.
Effie Hall. I think we're lucky here in Poweshiek County that when you go to the polls, there's no waiting line. But we have seen just clips of people standing in cities for 3 hours. And I can't conceive of doing that, 3 hours. And I know that Oregon does voting by mail. And considering the problems we're having now in Florida, is there any research or any thinking or any conversation about going to all mail? And is that even possible?
Or we're hearing Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. I mean, sort of we have more kind of open and liberal, not ideological liberal, but making voting easier through things like voting by mail. I mean, that's your only option in Oregon, is to vote by mail or to have a mail ballot and cast it. I suspect there is a conversation like that. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I mean, if we're headed in the direction, it seems, of cracking down on voting, making it harder for people to vote. After about the election of 2000, with the hubbub of the outcome, there was a renewed interest in election administration and making it easy as possible for people to vote. And at that point, a few states, or quite a few states, actually moved to same-day registration. What's happened is that we're moving away from things like that now. So I can't imagine that, whether or not it's a good idea, I can't imagine it having any political legs in this environment right now when you have so many battles so many that are taking the other stance on it.
Barb, Greg Bunce. Going back to primary elections in Iowa and the requirement that one be registered as a Democrat or a Republican, are there any data on people changing their registration prior to the primary election and then changing back? And if so, what does it show?
Yeah, I don't know there are data. You could look at the voting, if you had the voter file in front of you. I'm not sure if they would have the continuous update, but you certainly get a sense of someone registered with one party. No. What you know for sure are the total number of people registered as Democrats, Independents, and I think Libertarians now, and maybe Green, and then no party. I think those are the 5 on the Iowa ballot. So for sure you have it at the aggregate level. At the individual level, Iowa makes it very easy to do what you're suggesting. You just walk to the polls and call yourself a Republican. If you're a Democrat, sign a sheet, and then you can actually, or at least you used to be able to, cast your ballot, walk away, and then sign yourself back. Those would probably be hard things to track, because I don't think they're going to update the data. And what's giving me pause when I initially said, oh yeah, you could track that, I'm not sure whether you'd catch all of those changes like that. I mean, people do it, usually for strategic reasons. They think that their voice in the opposite party's choice of nominees is going to either derail the person or give their party a better chance. I mean, that's about all I can say. I suspect there is research that approaches the question in a more sophisticated fashion than I am.
We are out of time. Barb, thank you so much. It was so interesting. Thanks so much. Everybody. everybody, before you go, will you make sure and fill out your evaluation form and either leave it on your seat